you're conjuring up ridiculous moral reasons as to why African slavery was just not quite so bad as white person slavery. Why? Well, because our skin is darker, and because we were oppressed, and because we was kings, bro!
You're very stupid and your argument is dumb.
Come on. They don't understand. They don't understand. Gonna get it. No, if you feel me. Holla all you kids all across the land. Come on. They don't understand. They don't understand.
Hey guys, so as you can tell by the title of the video, I'm making this in Jabari's defense because a YouTuber named Adam No Eve made a video reviewing one of his alternate history scenarios where he accused him of making an Afrocentric argument claiming that Africa would be a peaceful utopia without European colonization, as well as advocating for anti-white racism. Okay, let's get into this.
Hello everyone, I am the Promethean, the rebel angel of rationality and reason. It's time to discuss a rather interesting topic. What if the Europeans had never settled in, conquered, Africa? That is the alternative history scenario that this old video I stumbled upon recently endeavored to illustrate. A Big Think article, which I'll link to below, proposes a different history in which Europeans never conquer Africa because nearly all of them, not just 30 to 60% of them, are wiped out by the bubonic plague and conquered by the Muslims. It is, to put it briefly, a load of Afrocentric left-wing nonsense. Basically, had the white devil Europeans never set foot on the African continent, this presentation supposes that Africa would have flourished into a tolerant, multicultural paradise. Just like the rhetoric of the left today, all cultures are equal except white people's. I won't bother with a full-length presentation exposing every single falsehood of this video, but I'll run through some of the footage and apply some of my random insidious white supremacist thoughts upon the assertions. Oh, and I also find it very amusing that the channel has also disabled comments on the video. Very telling, isn't it?
Okay, first of all, I assume that he didn't review his other content to confirm that he is indeed an Afrocentrist. Second of all, it's pretty obvious that not all leftists possess that bigoted sentimentality that you just mentioned. Third of all, even though the original video's comments may have been disabled as of the time you uploaded this response video, the comments are perfectly available for me to read as of the time I'm making this critique.
Alright, let's get on with it.
Hello everybody, it's Jabari here. Have you ever wondered what Africa would be like today without European influence?
Myself personally, no. But black supremacist organizations such as BLM, not to mention our entire media and educational system in the West, have been teaching critical theory and post-colonial deconstructionism to methodically dismantle European ideas and influence in order to resurrect their mythological, multicultural, non-white paradise, just as you are right now.
Your stance on the issue of Black Lives Matter extremists advocating for Africa to be completely free of Western influence is irrelevant to this topic, as this is an alternate history scenario, not a racial propaganda video.
Black Africans already have the entire continent to themselves, yet under the laws of pro-immigration and multiculturalism in white countries, we Europeans cannot claim any exclusive ownership to a strip of land even as small as a shopping mall or a house without condemnation from the colored community.
While the current population of Africa is still predominantly black, these people are generally not consciously trying to maintain a racial majority. Western countries, on the other hand, have historically advocated for the exclusion of other races in order to maintain majority white ethno-states. And there are non-Western countries controlled by non-white people that have practiced, and in some cases still do practice, race theory, colonialism, and the concept of ignorant savages no different from their Western counterparts such as Japan, Israel, and Liberia.
European influence is being removed not just from Africa, but the entire human race. And the results are a horrifying descent into poverty, mental retardation, cultural decline, and civil unrest.
And none of that would have happened if the Europeans hadn't fucked up everything and instead learned to coexist peacefully with the Africans and treat them as equals. Have you ever heard of the Meiji Restoration period? It was an era of rapid industrialization that led to Japan becoming one of the most technologically modernized countries in the world, and this is thanks to the United States pressuring Japan to end its reign of isolationism and establish trading relations with the West. And the only reason why Tonga wasn't colonized was because they were willing to convert to Christianity, never mind the fact that the Congo Kingdom would later be colonized during the scramble for Africa, despite the fact that it peacefully converted to Christianity thanks to the influence of the Portuguese.
It's a question that's always wandered throughout my thoughts. Just thinking of the powerful centralized kingdoms and governments and states that existed throughout the African continent, and just wondering What would have happened if they had never been conquered or destroyed by European powers?
Well, to put it briefly, they would have probably been conquered by Arab Muslims instead, and in fact they already were.
The Arab conquests of North and East Africa were not committed with the goal of establishing racial dominance over the indigenous inhabitants and were more based on the spread of Islam. In fact, the Arab conquest of the Levant is considered to be a peaceful conquest, as the Jews living there were willing to peacefully convert to Islam, leading to a simple drastic change in culture.
If you can't bother yourself to watch this entire presentation, I can't believe I even did, then here's the teal deer version. Without white Europeans, the Muslim Arabs would have conquered the entire African continent instead, and treated them to a far worse degree than European powers.
Again, no they wouldn't have, because the Arab conquests were not done with the same mechanisms and motivations as the European conquests. The Arab conquests were done for religious reasons, while the European conquests were done for economic and political reasons. Also, if you're going to argue that the brutality of slavery under Arabs was worse than slavery under Europeans, then I invite you to look up the treatment of slaves in the Congo Free State under King Leopold II of Belgium, the treatment of Haitian slaves during French colonial rule, and the treatment of Taino slaves under Christopher Columbus.
Yet the creator of this video is under the delusion that anything Arabs have done against Africans isn't quite so bad as what white people did, because Arabs are a closer skin color to blacks, I suppose.
Or because Jabari has done significantly more extensive research on African history than you ever did because you've been brainwashed into thinking that sub-Saharan Africa lacked any advanced civilizations prior to European imperialism.
Obviously, this isn't going to be 100% accurate and will rely on lots of approximations, as there are very many variables that can influence the outcome of African civilizations.
Well, you do have a point. It's certainly not accurate, but the only reason that I've seen you seriously consider, out of all the multitudes that you're talking about, is that the one of European influence on the continent, which was relatively mild and came later into the picture than did the influence of non-African Arab Muslims.
The reason why sub-Saharan Africa is in such a massive state of strife the way it is today is because of European colonialism.
It took over 500 years, however, for Europeans to finally acquire the ability to conquer Africa militarily due to significant military technological advances during this time.
So the Europeans had not even conquered the Africans for 5 centuries, and that was long after the Muslims had carved up North Africa for themselves. Europe was a technologically superior civilization, so why would you want to live in one that is less?
There were several environmental factors that impeded the successful colonization of Africa, and one of the main catalysts that sparked the successful European conquest of the entire continent was when British explorers discovered the source of the Nile River in 1858. Also, most of the advanced technology that the Europeans possessed were acquired from Egypt, the Middle East, and China. Additionally, since when did Jabari ever say that he wanted to live in a civilization that was less technologically advanced than Europe?
Unlike the 3 Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, African religions are very tolerant. In most African societies, religion was not forced upon you upon penalty of death, nor were there penalties or holy wars for the sole purpose of converting people to their religion.
Oh God, the whole every religion is more peaceful and tolerant than Christianity fallacy. Look, I am Lucifer. I don't exactly live on great terms with Christianity or its god Jehovah. But, all things considered, African tribal cults were a far cry from any peaceful, sophisticated religions of the Far East.
Jabari didn't say that African traditional religions were peaceful. He simply said that they were much more tolerant than the 3 Abrahamic religions, including Christianity.
I mean, according to just one source from the human rights activist websites, despite the African Charter on Human and People's Rights that provides an individual is entitled to respect for his life and integrity of his person, ritual killings and the practice of human sacrifice continue in several African countries. These practices entail the hunting down, mutilation, and murder of most vulnerable people in society, including people with disabilities, women, and children. Reports indicate that killings of this nature occur in Nigeria, Uganda, Swaziland, Liberia, Botswana, South Africa, Tanzania, Namibia, and Zimbabwe. Because of the secrecy involved in ritual sacrifices, a majority of these incidents go unreported and uninvestigated. These acts of violence are treated as spiritual practices and are based on barbarian superstitions that outweigh anything I can find in Christianity. Going on with the article, motivations to carry out these acts include the use of human body parts for medicinal purposes and the belief that human body parts possess supernatural powers that bring prosperity and protection. Christianity isn't exactly an icon of ethics and reason, but most people in Western civilizations aren't still killing each other and sacrificing each other due to tribal superstitious beliefs.
Are you suggesting that the various acts of brutality committed by other cultures around the world throughout history, such as Sharia law in the Middle East, the various torture devices and methods utilized by Europeans during the medieval times, acts of scalping committed by Native Americans in North America, the practice of human sacrifice committed by the Aztecs, and the practice of cannibalism among the Mari pale in comparison to those barbaric acts committed by Africans that you've just mentioned?
One such example is voodoo, found in several Caribbean islands. So again, not to beat a dead horse, these religions were very important to the people who practiced them. They just weren't nearly as aggressive or imposing as Abrahamic religions were.
Consider that people with albinism, basically an African with pure white skin, are ostracized and outright murdered in Africa. Albinos are regularly murdered and their body parts are harvested, and witch doctors sell them on the black market, believing they harness magical powers. That is voodoo. No doubt that if Europeans had never colonized the African continent, this superstitious savagery would probably still continue in an exponentially more appalling degrees, except for one major issue. Even if the Europeans never converted the African continent to Christianity, there exists another Abrahamic religion that would have done more brutally and quickly done so. That religion is Islam.
Voodoo is a religion, which means that its beliefs and practices have merits. Also, why do I see people demonize historical figures like the conquistadors Hernan Cortez and Francisco Pizarro, despite the fact that the indigenous civilizations they subjugated during the 16th century were hateful conquest empires that oppressed neighboring kingdoms? Furthermore, by insisting that Africa would have been conquered by Arabs instead of Europeans, you're starting to sound like an Israeli settler legitimizing the theft of a Palestinian home.
You are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is gonna steal it.
No.
But if Hitler didn't exterminate the Jews, then Stalin would have. If the Japanese didn't colonize Ecuador, then the Russians surely would have. If the British didn't colonize Australia, then the French surely would have. If the Spanish didn't conquer America, then the Portuguese would have. If China didn't annex Tibet, then India surely would have. Do you get the point?
Within a century of its birth in Mecca, Islam quickly spread all throughout the Middle East, Southern Europe, as well as Northern Africa, and along the East African coast. It even made its way to Western Africa, influencing empires such as the Mali and the Songhai.
So, Africans were oppressed by Christianity, indeed, and yet you expect them to be any better off under Islam? You seem to have forgotten that Islam is not an African religion at all. It is an Arab religion.
Did you even listen to what Jabari just said? Did you even pay attention to the map that he just showed? He literally stated that Islam originated in Mecca, which is in Arabia, and spread throughout the Middle East and into North Africa, as well as West and East Africa, in addition to some parts of Europe. Also, you seem to have forgotten the fact that Jabari earlier stated that Islam is an Abrahamic religion that engaged in holy wars as opposed to the generally more tolerable African religions that he mentioned.
Unlike the three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, African religions are very tolerant. In most African societies, religion was not forced upon you upon penalty of death, nor were there penalties or holy wars for the sole purpose of converting people to their religion.
Maybe you're the one who's deluded here, Lucifer.
Even without European Christianity in Africa, the native religions would still be too weak to fend off an even more oppressive and monotheistic religion. And you, however, seem perfectly content with this.
There are plenty of indigenous African religions that were compatible with Islam, particularly in West Africa. Also, stop strawmanning Jabari as being solely anti-Christian.
Africa probably wouldn't even be called Africa, as Africa is a name derived from Europeans. Since Africa lacked many native scripts, Arabic would have held sway as the dominant writing system. Arabs themselves refer to sub-Saharan Africa as Zanj, which means land of the blacks. TheBigThink.com called it Al-Gabulan, which apparently also means land of the blacks.
Actually, the name Africa has a very convoluted origin, the most popular being that it was imposed by the Romans after defeating Carthage, but there are many more hypotheses regarding its origins. For example, the first-century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus asserted that it was named for Epher, grandson of Abraham, according to Genesis 25:4, whose descendants he claimed had invaded Libya. Isidore of Seville, in his 7th century Etymologia, suggests Africa comes from the Latin aprica, meaning sunny. Massey, in 1881, stated that Africa is derived from the Egyptian Afruika, meaning to turn toward the opening of the ka. The ka is an energetic double. For every person, and the opening of the ka refers to the womb or birthplace. Africa would be, for Egyptians, the birthplace.
Well, thanks for the trivial hypotheses. I'll give you a thumbs up for that.
So, this is ironic. The advocate of this video hates the name that is cognizant of the many cultures and tribes of Africa, and yet he would prefer his continent to be directly associated with his people of his skin color, which is awfully racist. Call it the land of the blacks, even though not all blacks live in or even originated from Africa. Trade a most likely not racist name for an incredibly racist name. Nice one, dude.
Okay, first of all, it's becoming more clear to me that you haven't actually watched a video, as Jabari clearly states in the clip that you've just presented that the land of the blacks name for Africa was the Arabic name for sub-Saharan Africa. Second of all, your accusations of anti-white racism against Jabari are starting to remind me of ethno-nationalist anime streamer Aristocracy's accusations of anti-Semitism against Bada Banada.
We weren't debating Israeli politics. Bada Banada was being an anti-Semite.
I love to see her explain that one. Let's go.
Like, that's what was going down there. He was being an anti-Semite. He was regularly using dog whistles against me.
Such as?
He regularly would bring up Holocaust analogies.
Oh, bring up a Holocaust analogy. Bring up a comparison to the world's most well-known settler colonial project. How dare you do that? It's anti-Semitic in of itself. Dog whistles? None listed. Where's the dog whistle? Where is it? Her one thing apparently is that I made Holocaust comparisons. Is that it? In the modern day, there's nothing existing in the world that is as close to Nazism as Israel is. Fact.
To use against me constantly as a way to get to me?
As a way to get to you. No, it's called a fucking argument. As a way to get to you. Like, she's like an emotional wreck, man. Everything that she's like is just like, this hurt my feelings. Like, an analogy isn't an attack on you. An analogy is an attack on your argument. An analogy is a counter-argument. Unbelievable.
And he just kind of like, and people just kind of treated it, a lot of small streamers just treat it like, oh, it's just, they're just...
She's like on the brink of fucking crying. God, this is incredible.
Debating Israel. There was no debating Israel. Like, there just wasn't.
You notice how she never refers to anything that I ever say? Baseless assertions every single time. It's just a cry. It's a fucking crybaby. It's just literal, like someone who just like cries and tries to elicit sympathy from her audience without being able to make any sort of coherent counter argument to deal with anything at all. A straight up crybaby.
He was only going to be, I was only going to be an okay Jew with him if I was okay with wiping all Jews off of the earth.
What? That is another mask-off moment right there. She's equating being against an Israeli ethno-state with wanting to wipe all Jews off the earth. That's what she said there, explicitly. So she's trying to frame me as an anti-Semite because I'm against an Israeli ethno-state, an Israeli settler colonial ethno-state that is currently doing genocide. I'm against that, so ergo, I'm an anti-Semite. That is her logic. That is so fucking mask off. Like, if you ever believe for a second her bullshit backtrack that she wasn't stating her own opinions when she was saying pro-ethno-state stuff in that video, she's saying it very clearly right there if you know what she means, if you know what she's specifically referring to. It obviously was her real opinion. There's no way you can sustain it, that it wasn't.
That's called anti-Semitism.
She's such a stereotype. The stereotypical, like, Israeli who, like, the first fucking instance of dealing with an argument or facts that they don't know how to react to, you're an anti-Semite. Weaponize anti-Semitism. I have a fucking video on that, specifically regarding Israel. It's so predictable. Weaponize anti-Semitism allegations. Israel's favorite tactic. There you go. I made that months ago, 6 months ago, before I even knew who this person was.
If the
Feels
only
like he
way as a
supports the
black person
Holocaust.
You're going to be
It does.
accepted.
Like Aristocracy against Bada Banada, you baselessly accuse Jabari of advocating for racism when they're simply presenting facts that don't conform with your biases.
As opposed to Europeans who had a more Eurocentric view of the world, having Europe at the top of the world and everything else at the bottom, Arabs viewed it the opposite, with Europe being at the bottom and everywhere else being above Europe.
Ah, I see. So the new map of Africa would be upside down, with Europe on the bottom, effectively putting those evil whites in their place at the bottom of the food chain. Oh, big fucking deal.
Jesus Christ, with you not paying any actual attention to the accurate points in the video, you're now sounding like that Polish anime streamer attacking Bada Banada's critique on the Holodomor genocide question.
I think that's wrong. Everyone knows that's wrong. That's the level that these people operate at.
That's a lie. That's a total lie.
While the hypothetical African countries are correctly based on cultural language and racial lines, I have to emphasize again that most of these fictional African countries would not even exist whether the Europeans would conquer them or not. Why? Because if the Europeans hadn't colonized Africa, then the Arab Muslim empires would have.
No, they wouldn't have.
Despite this extremely large Islamic presence on the African continent, traditional kingdoms would still exist under traditional languages, religions, and ways of life, many of which would grow and expand and even absorb some of these Islamic empires.
Indigenous African tribes were conquered and converted to Islam faster and more violently than any Christian nation had, which only used deception to convert its followers.
And like Jabari and I said, there were plenty of African kingdoms, empires, and confederations consisting of their own traditional religions that were powerful enough to be compatible with Islamic civilizations.
Arabs did not consider themselves black or African any more than white Europeans did, and also considered their own race superior to blacks.
Yeah, and Arabs also considered themselves to be superior to North African Berbers.
In fact, the Arab word for slave, abid, is the same word for a black African, awfully similar to how the English word slave means Slav, or Eastern European, who were enslaved by Western Europeans long before blacks ever were.
Yeah, and the word Celt originates from the Greek word Keltoi, meaning barbarian. In addition, Irish people, along with Italians, weren't even considered white until the 19th century. And while it's true that Arabs did use the words black and slave interchangeably, black Africans were still allowed to convert to Islam. As a matter of fact, Somalia, a country ruled by black Africans, is predominantly Islamic and is even a member of the Arab League.
Black Africans were automatically seen by Muslims as slaves. In the Hadith, there are also verses which forbid Muslims from bringing black into their pedigree, or that allow an Arab man to marry a black woman, but not a black man to marry a lighter-skinned woman.
That wasn't always the case, because as I've just stated, there were plenty of black African Muslims who maintained their own Islamic civilizations despite the unequal treatment in Arab societies.
One Ethiopian woman in the Hadith lamented her inferiority to light-skinned Arabs, and the Prophet Muhammad consoled and praised her for her African submission to Islam.
While Islam did harbor some racist aspects towards non-Muslim groups, it is significantly more tolerant than Christianity, and the Arabic conquest of North and East Africa was more motivated by the expansion of Islamic influence. If the Arab expansion into Africa was motivated by anti-black racism, then why did they marginalize the Berbers and conquer the Iberian Peninsula?
The reason for this is that Islamic and Arabic presence on the African continent was largely slow and methodical in comparison to Christian and European presence.
The Islamic conquest of Africa was slow and methodical, you say? Are you freaking kidding? The early Muslim conquests spread like wildfire, and they did so by the sword, swiftly expanding from the Arab Peninsula to kill and convert the Berbers and Andalusians. It took the Romans nearly 600 years to methodically conquer most of Europe and North Africa, but the Muslims carved out an empire twice its size across the Middle East, Persia, half of Africa, and even encroaching Europe in barely 1 century.
The slow and methodical expansion described by Jabari details the process of African kingdoms converting to more tolerant forms of Islam, such as the Mali Empire, as opposed to the rapid expansions under the Rashidun and Umayyad caliphates. Also, there were various indigenous African kingdoms that utilized swords.
Unlike Christian and European nations, is that the entire economy and political structure of the African continent was firmly tied into that of Islamic and Arabic empires.
Alright, at this point I have the slightest feeling that you are in favor of Islam and Arabs who treated you even worse than the Europeans just because they're a darker shade of skin color than them.
Like I said earlier, this is simply an alternate history scenario that details what Africa would be like without European influence and not a racial propaganda video.
The European or white exploitation of Africans and their land isn't the dominant theme of my channel. I mean, we hear about that enough already, and it's pretty depressing. It's refreshing to hear something good about African history for once. I also teach these things truthfully and back them up with reliable sources. I don't just dig through random shady forums and websites and try to find whatever fits my agenda the best. I do lots of research using reliable sources. Even if it's information that I'm 100% sure is true, I make sure I have the sources at hand, and even cite them throughout my narrations. In doing this, I also don't promote hatred towards whites or insult other countries while putting Africans on a pedestal. I mean, that's just not cool at all. I like to educate people of all races, ages, and genders all around the world about African history, and I don't need to tear down the history and culture of other people and other races to do that. I also don't exaggerate or embellish the accomplishments of Africans, or make them out to be better than anyone else. I give credit where credit is due. So if I'm discussing an African achievement, I'm discussing an African achievement. Period. It's not a competition, it's just education. I don't hate whites or any other race. I hate the things that whites have done to my ancestors in the past, as I should. However, I don't hate any human being unless that individual human being gives me a reason to hate them. I simply want to discuss the history of Africans and bring all of the neglected yet interesting and complex aspects of it to light.
By the way, that video was uploaded a few weeks before you posted your response.
Islamic nations also had strict codes in regards to waging warfare against fellow Islamic nations. This allowed traditional kingdoms to grow and develop technologically and economically.
Conflict between Arab-Muslim dynasties was on par with those of European kingdoms. I would think that putting an end to warfare entirely, rather than just fighting under these rules, is the goal of a truly superior nation.
Oh my god, dude. This isn't a video game. If you look at history through the lens of video game systems, you're gonna have a very skewed view. Human societies in real life, including in Europe itself, did not follow some binary tech tree based on a European reference point, and they definitely did not progress at varying speeds from prescribed milestone to prescribed milestone. If you judge indigenous civilizations by how far along you think they were in a tech tree, based on an idealized European view on what achievements constitute progress, of course they're going to look less progressed. Just like if you did the same thing, but the other way around.
See, even the Europeans had flaws, and as I stated earlier, their success wouldn't have been possible without influence from the Middle East and China.
Though some African people were already using their own scripts prior to European arrival, most of them were symbolistic and none of them were as widespread as those of the ones like Ge'ez or Arabic. Nor could they really be used to write anything as intricate as a full-blown book or novel.
So, the primitive hieroglyphics of African tribes were so inferior to the writing systems of European and Arab civilizations that they could never produce a literary work such as the Iliad or the Quran. According to you, if it were not for Europeans or Arabs, the African continent would still be painting symbols on cave walls in animal blood. Your words, not mine.
You're putting words in Jabari's mouth when all he stated was that most of said writing systems were simple hieroglyphics and not actual scripts, just like how the Inca Empire used knotted strings for numerals but lacked an actual writing system. Also, Ge'ez is an African script of Semitic origin.
And now we arrive to what I think is the most entertaining part, that being, well, the elephant in the room. Slavery. Let's see how this goes down, shall we?
So one big question you guys probably have now is, would there still be slavery? And to answer that question, it would be a yes and a no.
Yes, you moron. There would absolutely still be slavery. And it would probably still exist to this very day as a normalized institution. Not like the mythical institution of racism. Slavery would still be perfectly normal. White European nations were, in fact, the first to abolish slavery and led the world, your world, in ridding it entirely. In fact, human trafficking still does exist today on a level unrivaled by any other continent in Africa and Islamic countries, all thanks to the departure of those evil white European colonists.
You do realize that the Europeans didn't abolish slavery of their own accord, right? As most of their ideas were innovated from other cultures around the world, even during the era of Western colonialism. Additionally, the instability, poverty, and oppression these developing countries are suffering from are the result of neo-colonialism, where the Europeans could have just simply helped them progress in a similar fashion as how the United States helped modernize Japan. Also, stop bringing up random points of anti-colored racism that aren't even mentioned in the video.
And what I mean by that is, would there still be slavery at all? And that would be a yes. Would it be the same type of slavery practiced during the transatlantic slave trade? No, it would not. The difference is...
No, because African slavery would surely be better, more virtuous, and a nicer kind of slavery. Just you wait and see.
Why don't you listen to him explain the distinction, you dipshit?
The slavery practiced by Europeans was something known as chattel slavery.
You are arguing semantics at this point, and you're desperate. Slavery is fucking slavery.
But did chattel slavery consist of the same exact practices performed under African slavery? Did chattel slavery have the same merits as African slavery? No, because Jabari's stance on chattel slavery is not arguing semantics. It'd be like the equivalent of saying that Chinese communism being different from Soviet communism under Stalin's regime is arguing semantics just because they both consist of the same oppressive acts. See, just like how Chinese communism doesn't involve death marches and gulags, African slavery didn't consist of the treatment of slaves as beasts of burden hereditarily. Now, before we move on, let me elaborate on the differences in practice between chattel slavery and the traditional forms of slavery practiced by Africans. Chattel slavery, the form of slavery practiced by European settlers in the Americas, consisted of the treatment of slaves as beasts of burden and was conducted for the sake of slavery solely on the basis of race. African slavery, on the other hand, usually consisted of the treatment of slaves as house servants and treated them on the basis of material circumstances, such as debt bondage or being prisoners of war, as well as ethnicity and geopolitics. So basically, African slavery had significantly more merits than chattel slavery. By the way, I think you're the one who's desperate, because you never bothered to look up the definition of chattel slavery to prove whether or not Jabari is arguing semantics regarding slavery, even though you based most of your information off sources aside from inferences, such as the child sacrifices in Africa, particularly Uganda.
When Europeans first began purchasing slaves from the West African coast during the mid-15th century, naturally, many people had mixed feelings about buying and selling human beings as property. Over time, Europeans began to think of moral reasons as justifications for enslaving people, such as the fact that the natives of the areas that they enslaved people from were not Christians.
Yes, Europeans were thinking of moral reasons to enslave people, just like you are right now, my friend. You're conjuring up ridiculous moral reasons as to why African slavery was just not quite so bad as white person slavery. Why? Well, because our skin is darker, and because we were oppressed, and because we was kings, bro!
Stop accusing Jabari of being an anti-white racist advocating for slavery. He's not. Just like how Bana Banata isn't an anti-Semite who advocates for the continued oppression of Jews just because he opposes to the existence of Israel as a pro-colonial Jewish ethno-state.
Eventually, the all too familiar, unquestionably racist views of Africans begins to develop. The subhuman status that Africans eventually acquired became the ethical basis and legal justification for the enslavement.
It wasn't the enslavement of blacks that led to theories of genetic differences between whites and blacks, but the other way around. Blacks were long considered by Europeans as mythical, subhuman creatures even before they had come in contact with them. And when they did, both sides were very suspicious of one another.
If that's the case, then why did an Ethiopian king named Menman fight alongside the Greeks in the Trojan War? Also, the radicalization of race theory actually began to take place during the Reconquista, when Jews and Muslims were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula after the Spanish victory. Additionally, the aspect that led to the radicalization of racism towards black people during chattel slavery in the United States came from power rather than race, as Native American slaves were difficult to keep due to the familiarity with their environment, unlike Africans who came from a foreign continent.
African slavery, however, was quite different. The types of slavery varied depending on what part of the continent that was practiced, and in some places it wasn't practiced at all. You also weren't considered property or disposable. You were still considered a human being, you were just unfortunate, either a prisoner of war or a criminal.
Oh, but you see, even though Africans practiced slavery, just like Europeans and every other fucking human being on Earth, African slavery was A-okay because it wasn't chattel slavery, and they were treated like human beings, and they were dignified, and do you not see how ridiculously fucked up this all is? You're arguing semantics, bud. Slavery is slavery, whether it's chattel slavery, quote, quote, or genetic, or whatever fucked up excuse you can make. Capturing people against their will for forced labor and sex is wrong, and Africans would keep doing it and have normalized it if it weren't for we Europeans.
Again, Jabari is not arguing semantics to legitimize and justify African slavery. He's just simply stating historical facts by pointing out the merits in African slavery despite it still being morally wrong. By the way, I can easily argue that Europeans would have been stuck in perpetual isolation and utilizing brutal torture mechanisms had it not been for Arab and Chinese influence.
In some cases, neighboring kingdoms and tribes would deliberately raid one another for the sole purpose of capturing slaves for profit. This practice reached astronomical levels upon contact with European traders.
It's almost as if fellow black Africans were actually complicit in the perpetuation of European and American and Arab slavery. Goes against the whole Europe oppression narrative a tad, eh? I'm sure if the Europeans never arrived, the Africans would have simply never enslaved one another, right?
Since when did Jabari ever say that Africa would be a peaceful utopia without European influence? Furthermore, can you prove to me that Europe would have been a peaceful utopia without Arabic or Chinese influence?
Despite the wide distribution of slavery on the African continent, as well as the many variations of slavery and the brutality associated with it, it was never in a way that would take away the humanity of those captured.
You have clearly never actually been a slave then, have you? Slavery dehumanizes people, period. If you own another person and you can make them do whatever you want without any kind of payment or compensation, they are your property. Everything else is just silly wordplay. I cannot honestly believe right now that someone who claims to be affected by a legacy of slavery for hundreds of years is actually advocating for slavery.
Jabari never once claimed that he was affected by a legacy of slavery in this video, nor has he done so in any of his other videos. And for the final time, he is not advocating for slavery. And neither does he harbor a victim mentality over black oppression.
My videos also focus primarily on the positive and interesting aspects of Black and African history, rather than just complaining, focusing on the negatives or the victimization of African history. However, of course it is necessary to point those things out at times, and when it's necessary, I do point them out. But the European or white exploitation of Africans and their land isn't the dominant theme of my channel. I mean, we hear about that enough already, and it's pretty depressing.
So, with all of this context, it seems that you have a mental block that prevents you from seeing nuance, Lucifer.
The Mali Empire, for example, had its own medieval Bill of Rights, and in Article 20, they specifically outline, "Do not ill-treat slaves. We are the master of the slave, but not the bag he carries."
The Europeans have another Bill of Rights, as a matter of fact. Unlike the Malis, ours says that slavery is completely outlawed. It's a crime. It is an unspeakable evil. Which African tribe of yours ever banned slavery outright?
The Nri Kingdom in present-day Nigeria is a prime example of an African society that actually opposed slavery and even served as a safe haven for runaway slaves. Then again, Western civilization owes their technological and moral success to multicultural influences, with the United States Constitution even having taken inspiration from the Iroquois Confederacy's oral constitution known as the Great Law of Peace.
So, anyways, with that bullcrap out of the way, I think it's time to haul in the motherload of facts on Islamic slavery in Africa. This Afrocentrist has venerated Islam, just like Christianity and Abrahamic non-African religion, for treating the Africans better than Christians did. Except that, compared to the slavery Europeans subjected on Africans, the slavery that Muslims imposed on the Africans was exponentially, monstrously more appalling and brutal. Europeans were involved in the African slave trade for only 3 centuries, but the Muslims enslaved Africans for more than 14 centuries. While 2 out of every 3 Africans enslaved by Europeans were men, 2 out of 3 Africans enslaved by Muslims were women. So much for those feminists. And they were used for sexual exploitation as concubines in harems and brothels. Male Africans, on the other hand, were enslaved by Muslims, were instead used for military service. That's right, whereas American black slaves were simply forced to perform labor and harvest crops, Muslims were forcing them to actually die in battle. Unlike American and European African slaves, who were allowed to breed, Muslims castrated their male slaves so that they could never reproduce at all. Sure enough, almost no African descendants of slaves are left in the modern-day Muslim world. Children born to slaves and Muslims were simply outright killed. Furthermore, it is estimated that around 11 million Africans were enslaved by the Europeans over 3 centuries. Yet, this pales in comparison to the number that were oppressed by Muslims through 14 centuries, 180 million Africans. According to historical records, the mortality rate for slaves on the transatlantic route was 10%, yet nearly 80 to 90% of Africans succumbed to the literal death marches across the Sahara Desert under Muslims. Just considering slavery, even though slavery itself is a monstrous evil, Africans at least had it a little bit better under Europeans than they did under the Muslims. And yet this video venerates Islam for preserving African civilization. My God.
No, this video does not venerate Islam for preserving African civilization, and while Muslim slavery was generally more brutal than European slavery with significantly higher statistics in slaves as well as death rates, there were a few instances practiced by Europeans that surpassed the brutality of Muslim slavery. During Christopher Columbus's reign as governor of Hispaniola, he established a forced labor system on the native Taino population known as the encomienda. The system was so brutal that the natives would rather commit suicide than live their lives as slaves. Even after Columbus was stripped of his governorship, the system would persist, leading to the virtual extinction of the Taino population. Some historians even claim that the encomienda was even worse than outright slavery. Back when Haiti was a French colony known as Saint Domingue, Africans were subjected to a variety of torture mechanisms, such as being burned, buried alive, raped, whipped, allowed to be bitten by swarms of insects, and having their limbs amputated. Some of these slaves even committed suicide in hopes of going back to their homelands, and women rarely birthed healthy children who often died young. During Belgian King Leopold II's reign over the Congo Free State, Belgian soldiers amputated the hands of slaves after killing them, raped their wives, razed villages to the ground, whipped children to death for laughing in the presence of a soldier, and babies died after being deliberately abandoned to maximize profits to meet the colony's rubber quota. Despite Leopold's efforts to save face by destroying the evidence of his tyranny, the atrocities were exposed to the world. It is estimated that approximately 10 million Congolese slaves died under Leopold's rule. Having said all that, one could also argue that the atrocities of Imperial Japan were even worse than those of Nazi Germany, as they were much more widespread and killed indiscriminately, unlike the Nazis, who were selective in their murders. Anyway, I find it hypocritical of you to accuse Jabari of arguing semantics regarding the differences between African slavery and chattel slavery when you also point out the scale of brutality between the forms of slavery under Europeans and Muslims, concluding that the latter was worse than the former.
I still think that a lot of the continent would lack any type of official borders.
Because only white Americans apparently set borders and build walls.
Medieval European kingdoms didn't have strict national borders either, and the United States of America probably wouldn't exist in this fictional timeline.
And the reason for this is very large portions of Africa, more particularly the interior of the continent as well as the southern portions of the continent, were still pretty tribal. There were still very, let's say, embryonic civilizations there. They hadn't reached any form of centralized government or kingdom yet.
Now, being a libertarian, one would think that I was in favor of this, but I am not. Because you see, what the video here is talking about isn't some anarcho-capitalist stateless society. These are nomadic, roaming, primitive tribes. That's right, the dude in this video has all but admitted that, were it not for European colonization or Muslim enslavement, Central Africa would never have settled and developed civilizations, and they would have remained roaming barbarians for the rest of history. Good job, Afrocentrists!
Jabari didn't apply that rule to all of Central and Southern Africa, and there actually existed advanced civilizations throughout Sub-Saharan Africa, even without Western and Islamic influences. Also, stop calling Jabari an Afrocentrist, because he's clearly not.
I mean, don't get me wrong, there were some pretty large and powerful kingdoms in the southern and interior of the continent. For example, the Zimbabwe Kingdom of Southern Africa, the Zulu, for example. They were all very powerful civilizations, and very large civilizations, but they were the exception, not the rule, of those regions of Africa.
Shaka Zulu killed more of his own people than any of his enemies ever did, and slaughtered nearly 2 million people throughout his reign. I believe a marker of true human progress is not to be a warmongering dictator, but that's just my ANCAP libertarian side speaking out.
Jabari clearly doesn't advocate for war either, and he only mentioned the Zulu kingdom, not Shaka Zulu. Would you associate the Inca Empire with Manco Inca just because he shares the same name as his kingdom, for example? I don't think so.
All in all, without European influence, I think Africa would have been a more stable continent economically and politically, and civilizations would have grown and progressed at a more casual and regular rate, similar to the rest of the world.
Alright, that was exhausting. I honestly don't believe that had the Europeans never settled in Africa, that Africa would have become anything more than it had continued to remain for thousands of years. That is, little small clusters of wandering nomadic tribes killing lions and elephants with spears, and essentially trotting over such a wealth of vast resources that they would never have been able to harness because they would have never been able to develop the technology.
I guess you didn't even research any of the advanced kingdoms Jabari mentions in the video you've presented, because those examples clearly contradict the point you've just made, since you're clearly uneducated on the topic of African history as a result of the misconceptions perpetuated by the Western media.
Now, on a final note, I think I can only agree on one point of this Afrocentric presentation. I believe, yes, that Europeans should have never entered Africa and gotten themselves into today's mess. Though I suppose even without racial tensions in America and Europe, we might still have internal conflict between other groups such as Protestants and Catholics or Germans and Italians and so forth. In fact, once the African nations witnessed the industrial rise of white civilization, they might probably have still envied our success and tried to invade our countries en masse.
En masse. It's en masse, not en masse, you fucking Philistine.
En masse.
Through sabotaging immigration policies. But I suppose that's an alternative history scenario all into itself.
For your information, Jabari has uploaded videos to his channel where he clearly opposes anti-white racism since you're unaware.
People who do any and everything they can to prove that white people are evil, primitive, barbaric, or uncivilized, and that we somehow saved them from their lives of savagery. Remember what I said about two wrongs don't make a right? Just like stealing history from others is wrong, racism is also wrong. Being a victim of it does not justify doing it to others. However, when it comes to these bigoted people, their primary agenda is to spread hatred towards whites and prove to the world that they are terrible human beings or monstrous entities. Sure, whites don't have the best track record when it comes to racism, genocide, or conquest, and in fact, they're probably responsible for the most mass deaths in all of human history. However, it wasn't their skin that did any of that. It was their civilizations and their cultures. It wasn't some collective 100% anti-colored, all-white effort that did it. Every human being is unique, and it's okay to hate the racists, but don't hate the race. If I meet a racist white guy, I have just as little respect for him as I would for you if you behave that way towards his race. I love all human beings on an individual basis, and until that individual loses my respect, he or she will continue to be loved by me regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, or nationality. If you believe that someone is inherently inferior to you in any way strictly due to their skin color, then you are an idiot, plain and simple.
This is another video that was posted long before you uploaded your response video, so this further disproves your accusations of Afrocentrism against Jabari.
In conclusion, whether the Europeans colonized Africa or they just left it off their maps, I think the black race will probably never be able to build a civilization of their own on par economically and technologically that of white Europe, unless there are some major changes and revisions in the current paradigm.
Again, that's literally happened even before the modern era.
If you agree or disagree, please do leave a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe, because I just might respond.
Well, someone's have to comment on your video addressing most of the same points that I've just made. So yeah, in conclusion, you are a
Poor old man.
If you enjoyed this video, please click the like button below and don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this. Thanks for watching.